Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Ebtc 10th anniversary symposium. I'm really happy to and excited to see that so many of you are joining and people are still joining. So let me just go over some logistics. So please put your questions in the Q&A and we will queue them up. So my colleague Sebastian Hoffman is going to be monitoring both chat and Q&A, and we'll present them to the speaker. We also will have a panel during which you can continue sending the questions, and we will try to address them as the event progresses. In case we don't answer some questions, we will make all the attempts to answer them individually to you. Again, thank you so much. And without further ado, I would like to present our first speaker, Marty Stevens, who is the founding director of Ebtc. Marty has had numerous awards over the years. He's very well-known and prominent researcher in the alternatives to animal testing field. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Marty to introduce us.
Thank you, Katya. As Katya said, I had the privilege of being the founding co-director of the Evidence-based Toxicology collaboration. And I'm very excited to be part of our celebration of our 10th anniversary, which is also my 10th anniversary with CAT, the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing. So our overall topic is evidence-based toxicology, past, present, and future. And what better way to start than to have a high-level overview, very brief, so it can provide some context for the later presentations. So what is evidence-based toxicology? It's a systematic effort to maximize transparency and minimize error in various research activities, conducting primary research, analyzing available evidence, as in systematic review, and using research in decision-making. It's a cross-cutting approach advanced by a community working together to develop and use evidence-based approaches. And I hope all this will be clarified by what you hear from the people who are involved in the Ebtc collaborations, past, present, and hopefully our future as well. So what is the Ebtc, the collaboration? It's a cross-sector collaboration. We have a small, efficient staff, a diverse board and scientific advisory council, hundreds of collaborating authors on dozens of papers and projects, and you could see many of our collaborators in the pictures at the right from our various symposia. So what are our objectives? The overarching one is promoting high quality, high impact research in toxicology and environmental health. But we have specific objectives such as raising research standards, which provides better evidence and less wasted research, making sense of evidence. This is probably what we're most well known for: systematic reviews, evidence maps, improving access to research. You'll hear more about this later. Things like fair data, open science, and advocating evidence-based decision-making. Here's where it all pays off, integrating evidence into policy making. Here are some examples of exactly the kinds of things that we do, hopefully demystifying the process, applying systematic methods to the development of adverse outcome pathways, a hot topic these days in toxicology, working with editors to improve publishing standards around systematic reviews, evaluating non-animal test methods for drug-induced liver injury. And you see some of our publications on the right. So it's about more than just systematic review. Funding sources, that's always an important point in these kinds of collaborations and when we do evidence synthesis. So our funding is provided by the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing, CAT, at the Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And the staff is a research group based at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. But more broadly than that, we're a cross-sector collaborative network. Members commit time and sometimes infrastructure to projects. And members include what you see here as examples: the US FDA, Tox Strategies, the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, SIOM, and many more. And it's important to note that we don't accept funding from sources with specific interest in the outcomes of our research, such as industry. So please join the collaboration. We operate on the Cochrane model, the Cochrane collaboration, running collaborative projects through thematic working groups. And we'll be launching a new network structure in 2022. So to join or get involved, simply begin perhaps by subscribing to our newsletter, which you can also subscribe to online at our website, or email Katja at her email address that you see here. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to Katja.
Thank you, Marty. Thanks so much. So with that introduction, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Thomas Harton, who is a professor of evidence-based toxicology at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and a director of CAT, Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing. So Thomas is the founder of EBTC and the EBT movement starting way back. So I'm giving the floor to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Katja. Good morning from Baltimore, everyone. It's a moment of pride to see that something we got started 10 years ago is now celebrating some of its achievements. And yeah, I've been on this from the very beginning, and I'm happy to talk about this some more. I'm associated mainly with the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing, as you know, but EBT, Evidence-based Toxicology, is not alternative methods with another name. It is an independent activity which we are hosting because I started initiating this already 20 years ago. And I will talk a little bit about how this all came about and how this was working. But I would not like to miss one important point. If this today is not enough for you, we have more to offer. We have started an entire course on Coursera on evidence-based toxicology, which, as you have seen, has been taken by almost 6,000 people so far. It is free of charge, $49 if you want a certificate, and it includes 13 lectures, some of people who are also involved in today's presentation. So Google Coursera evidence-based toxicology if you're interested in more than this. Okay, so you see a younger version of me here. At the time, student of biochemistry and medicine in Tübingen, and evidence-based medicine was the new thing in the 80s and early 90s, getting more and more physicians excited about applying systematic reviews and others in handling all of this overwhelming information in medicine. And I developed later into a pharmacologist, was working also as a clinical pharmacologist, leading some studies, and then some principles of evidence-based medicine were simply normal to me. And really a lot of this is about helping to get the overwhelming scientific literature under control. William Osler is one of the iconic figures in Hopkins, and he already more than 100 years ago said something, it is astonishing with how little reading a doctor can practice medicine, but it is not astonishing how badly he may do it. The big problem is you have so many questions with each and every patient. You need something which is condensed and which is true, and you can rely on. PubMed alone is getting 23 million references, or has 23 million references, articles since 1946. It is more than 5,600 journals which are regularly inputting here. Per year, 1 million citations roughly is entering. So this is, nobody can read it and then decide what is working. So some people have to do it for others. And this was one of the basic ideas of Archie Cochrane at Oxford when he started the Oxford database of perinatal trials. He was interested in children's. He said, we have to find something which is a repository of these studies, which is condensing them to the most important information we can take. And this is how the Cochrane collaboration started, because this idea was intriguing, and others said, what he does here, we need for other areas. And it was 1993 until the Cochrane collaboration was formally formed. More than 30,000 scientists and physicians are working on this. The number of reviews is continuously increasing. A second line of work came out of Canada, McMaster mainly. Here the term evidence-based was actually coined and has been promoted since. These are cross-talking initiatives which are very importantly shaping what clinically is known as evidence-based medicine or evidence-based healthcare nowadays. For me, when focusing more and more again on also on in vitro methodologies and animal studies, I had a very important kickoff with this book by Eddie Neugebauer. Eddie Neugebauer was later also the head of Cochrane Germany, and he showed that the same approaches can actually be applied to in vitro work and to animal studies as they can for clinical studies. In his handbook here, he reviewed mediators of septic shock, and he showed that every information can be handled like this. And this was an aha moment for me. I learned something. And when I took over in 2002 the European Center for Validation of Alternative Methods at the beautiful Lago Maggiore, I made a bit of a laundry list of things I would like to do. And I put on my list evidence-based medicine for validation. So the idea was, can we more objectively assess animal studies and their alternatives? Can we, instead of making this a war of faith, do an objective assessment of the existing information to compare methodologies, something evidence-based medicine has been doing in other fields. And it took the right person to get this done. And in my case, this was Sebastian Hoffman, my PhD student, who joined me also at ECVAM as our statistician. And his thesis developed to something which in the end was entitled Evidence-based in vitro toxicology in 2005. He finished this work. And this is from his introduction. In this thesis, principles and tools of evidence-based medicine are systematically applied to in vitro toxicology. And it was Sebastian who was really exploring with me also in the first manuscript these things. So in 2005, at the World Conference on Alternative Methods, I had the privilege to give a keynote lecture. And in this keynote lecture, I called on the scientific community to create an evidence-based toxicology. Evidence-based medicine goes in vitro. This is the original slide, which I showed in Berlin in 2005. Saying, yeah, we have tools, we have validation studies. That's something I knew at the time very well. We have quality assurance, like good laboratory practice, good cell culture practice, and we have systematic reviews and meta-analysis coming from EBM, and we should marry these. Sebastian and myself wrote in the same year an article about how much toxicology is similar to setting a diagnosis in medicine. That we have really to apply a lot of the same thinking, like what is the difference whether you have a patient and after a few tests to say you have cancer, or you run a few tests on a chemical and you say you're carcinogenic. Intellectually, it's very similar. And for this reason, we very quickly identified we have to look mainly into evidence-based medicine for diagnostics. And we wrote this article, Towards an Evidence-Based Toxicology, to lay out this idea. in parallel, there was some work by Phil Gutselian and his group on suggesting evidence-based toxicology mainly as a framework for causation. So how can we show that a certain substance has a certain health effect? And we really thought we can learn from ABM in applying these important tools. We can limit biases. We can appraise the information we have, and we can synthesize evidence, very similar to evidence-based medicine. And we applied the systematic approach in defining a very specific research question and defining selection criteria for studies, what to include, what to exclude, how to extract the data, and how to appraise the evidence and data quality. And these were the discussions which we had when we organized the first evidence-based toxicology conference in 2007 at the beautiful Lake Como in Italy. 170 people joined us from all 5 continents and discussed this concept, and in the end came up with the Declaration of Como, calling on the scientific community to create something like evidence-based toxicology. And we have been pursuing this first out of Europe, and when I left in 2008, they gave up. There was no activity left. I got the first chair for evidence-based toxicology by Johns Hopkins, the first chair and only chair I'm aware of so far, with an endowment of the Dörnkamp zu Binden Foundation. So they put some 3.5 million behind this so that Hopkins will have a chair in this direction as long as Hopkins does exist. And this is an article when starting the activities. I laid out some of my ideas on evidence-based toxicology, how different elements would form this type of movement. But we also saw problems. What we lack is typically access to data. A lot of toxicology takes place behind paywall, not paywalls, behind the walls of regulatory agencies and owned by companies. We don't have an information portal to share systematic reviews like the Cochrane Library. We have to develop the tools of meta-analysis, especially when dealing with very different types of information. We don't have really quality scoring tools. And I also said, in the end, we need something which moves the way of risk assessment towards something which I see as probabilistic risk assessment, because our ways of risk assessment are not really made for EBT approaches. Then we organized a conference which we called 21st Century Validation for 21st Century Tools. And in this context, I gave one of the 4 presentations, which was evidence-based toxicology, the toolbox of validation for the 21st century. And this hit some nerves, and a few people at the conference decided spontaneously to meet next morning for breakfast at my home. And a lot of these people are still around, and we created something which then became the evidence-based toxicology collaboration. You see here some of the starting members of this collaboration. We started on the 10th of March 2011. This is what we are celebrating today as 10 years of creation of the evidence-based toxicology collaboration. And only a year later, we created a European branch. Again, we created a European steering group, and we brought these 2 elements together by providing a joint secretariat for these 2. This led then over time to the development of an original mission and vision, which we then shortened up. So our current mission and vision is more precise and better coined. So we have a joint vision. In the meantime, we have fused the 2 boards to organizing groups to form the Evidence-Based Toxicology Collaboration International, with increasing involvement also of people from outside the transatlantic partnership here. The first conference took place in Research Triangle Park in 2012. These are 2 or 4 articles which came out of this workshop. We mapped the opportunities and challenges, but also we showed already here that there's perspectives, for example, for the validation of high throughput assays like the ToxCAS and TOX21 assays. We then held a workshop in 2015 on the emergence of systematic review in toxicology, which brought together all of the organizations which were in the meantime starting to apply evidence-based toxicology. This included EFSA in Europe, the National Toxicology Program, and the EPA. And we got some type of consensus report on that this is a tool we should use. We also replicated this in, we replicated this at the the FDA, and a total of 270 FDA employees did join us when we were teaching on evidence-based toxicology and systematic reviews. So this showed already the early interest in these methodologies. In the meantime, this has become something which is a topic for many of the major agencies, and including the OECD. So this is something which is high up on the agenda, because we realize more and more we need systematic reviews here. There's a number of challenges, and we are tackling them slowly, one by one. I listed them here again because even when looking backward and seeing the achievements, there's still a lot on the agenda, especially the diverse study types in toxicology represent a challenge. Availability of data is still an issue. The limited nature of the existing guidance, even with a primer on systematic reviews being available, the enormous publication biases and so on. And there's a general resistance to change. And there's also many people who believe that this would take away their professional judgment, because these are objective tools, and then why do you need the toxicologist still? This is not true. It is only a tool to guide us all in what is available. So I'd like to close with Bertolt Brecht. You know, he's a poet, not a or was a poet, not a scientist, but in his work Galileo, he wrote something, I think, which is really key. The chief aim of science is not to open a door to infinite wisdom, but to set a limit to infinite error. And I think this is exactly what evidence-based toxicology is about, getting rid of some of our infinite errors in not evaluating the evidence correctly. And I'm looking forward to an exciting symposium today to hear about some of the things which happened over the last year and what is to come.
Great. Thank you so much, Thomas. It's always exciting talks, and great to hear, to see that perspective going back really more than 10 years when you first started it. Thank you so much. So with that, I would like to move on to the next more fun part of the agenda, which is a few polls. So Sebastian Hoffman, as you already had an introduction from Thomas, he is a research fellow at Ebtc. He's working from Germany, one of the key Ebtc staff. So Sebastian, floor is to you.
Thank you, Katja. Yeah, I hope you don't get the expectation too high. Let's see how funny it will be. Yeah, we have a great program and even greater talks, but we felt we might sprinkle in a few polls to make it even more interesting, if at all possible. The first two are quite tricky, but don't be afraid. We won't make them public. At least if you answer them wrong, we won't. You stay anonymous. So let me try if I get everything here on stage. So please fill in the poll you should see now. What does EBTC stand for? Okay, there's still some answers trickling in. But I learned it's like popcorn, when it stops popping, then it's okay. So I'll stop the poll now. I'll share it with you. Okay, I'm a bit disappointed that nobody picked eBitcoin. We did a long internet search to come up with that one. Okay. Thank you. Let's move on to the next. That's even that's a bit more challenging. if at all possible. So please answer the next poll. Okay. Sharing the results with you. Most got it right. Yeah, we are not yet 100 years old, but only 10. Some went for 2007. That's probably because of Thomas' presentation. That was when we held the first EBT forum, so some years earlier. Thank you. With that, we come to a last poll, which is a little bit preparing you for the 4 presentations that are to come. And this is about the activities that you consider most important, the EBTC activities you consider most important. You should see the poll now. This is a multiple choice. You can click several answers. Okay, I'm closing the poll now and share it with you. And that's quite interesting picture. There's not really one favorite, but it's quite evenly distributed, the answers. Okay, with that, the fun part is over, I'm afraid, and we now move into the presentations. Katja, do you take over again?
Yes, sure. It's interesting to see that people consider all the areas that we're working on very important. So we need more resources to do more work, I guess. So thank you, Sebastian. So it's also good to see that people are still awake after Thomas's presentation. So with that, we start our second part, which is the formal presentation. So each presentation is 12 minutes with a 3-minute Q&A. And again, please put your questions in the Q&A. So the first presenter is Dr. Kris Thayer. She was a director of IRIS and one of the pioneers of systematic reviews. And she also is on the board of Evidence-based Toxicology Collaboration. So Kris, with that, welcome.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the introduction, and I really enjoyed the presentation and the polls. So I want to talk a little bit about the implementation of systematic review within EPA's integrated risk information system. A little bit about me. So I'm the division director of a program referred to as the Chemical Pollutant and Assessment Division, or CPAD. We're located within EPA's Office of Research and Development. Most of the staff who contribute to IRIS, or these integrated risk information system assessments, reside in this division, but not exclusively. It's very much a team matrix operation. Previously, I directed the National Toxicology Program, Office of Health Assessment and Translation, or OHAT. And so through these two opportunities, I've had a lot of experience in onboarding systematic review methods in environmental health. First was with OHAT. And as you saw from Thomas's talk, a lot of this activity was really starting to gel around 2010, a little bit earlier in some areas, a little bit later in some areas, but probably around the same time, NTP and OHAT became interested in systematic review. So this was, I think, probably one of the first really launches of systematic review more formally within a US federal program. So I was there, and then in 2017, I joined EPA, And at that time, I directed what was referred to as the IRIS program, the IRIS division. And at that time, and I'll get into this a little bit more later, but EPA was not new to systematic review in terms of the IRIS program. They had spent some years really kind of thinking about the methods, developing some approaches, but maybe the areas that we're struggling with was a little bit about how to sort of foster consistency and how to sort of really refine some of the trickier methodologies. For example, evaluation of studies, thinking about structured approaches for evidence integration. So that's when I came on board, and I brought with me sort of experience with a suite of specialized software applications that really make more efficient the process of systematic review. So since 2017, I'd say the IRIS program has really sort of stabilized our systematic review methods. In addition to using a specialized suite of software applications, we have, and this would be both in the NTP and the EPA, have experience in a research portfolio and really trying to use artificial intelligence to facilitate systematic review. For those of you who follow this field, you know that there's been a lot of very good experience, positive experience in using artificial intelligence to help facilitate the process of screening studies to identify those that should be included. Now the next wave is really trying to sort of help facilitate the very tedious and expensive process of data extraction, where you're trying to summarize study method and findings. And so that's really sort of the next wave, and Michelle Angrish from my group will have a talk on that later. So IRIS human health assessments contribute to decisions across EPA and other health agencies. I would say IRIS assessments are one of the most visible human health assessment products in the world. They undergo a great deal of scrutiny, and I'll talk about that in a few more slides. But what IRIS does is they produce toxicity values. So for non-cancer, this would be reference doses or reference concentrations, depending on whether the exposure is oral or inhalation. For cancer, oral slope factors or inhalation unit risk values. So again, IRIS assessments are developed in EPA's Offices of Research and Development. So they don't have any direct regulatory impact until they're combined with information about extent of exposure to people, the cost of cleanup, available technology, regulatory options. And within EPA, all of these are under the purview of EPA Program Office. So the IRIS assessment is one input into the very sort of complex decision-making that happens within EPA's Program Offices that administer statutes. Just for anybody who might be interested, here's the link to the IRIS website, and you can also find here the active the active chemicals that we're working on. I do want to indicate, though, that my division does more than IRIS assessments. So IRIS tends to be sort of the more complex chemical assessments, the arsenics, the formaldehyde, the chromium, a lot of human evidence, a lot of animal evidence, a lot of in vitro evidence. In addition to that, we have other products that are a bit more customized for certain decision-making contexts and tend to have not quite the same extensive evidence base. So they might be mostly driven by animal toxicology, but maybe a few studies. We also have approaches for thinking about chemicals where there's really not even sort of a traditional evidence base, and the primary analysis is more in silico or modeled evidence. So in terms of the methods used within the IRIS program, a lot of the systematic review methods are described in something referred to as the IRIS handbook. It's really intended to be a standard operating procedure for staff who conduct assessments. It's important to note that it includes systematic review plus, and that plus would be methods for doing dose response methods. So we would consider this to fall outside of systematic review. And as I indicated, the emphasis within EPA on systematic review really began in 2011 with an NAS formaldehyde report. So this was an NAS, National Academy of Science, peer-reviewed report on formaldehyde. And the Academy, the panel had observations and comments on the actual analysis of the formaldehyde conclusions, but they had also recommended really that the EPA begin to implement systematic review to improve the transparency of the methodologies. So this, again, started in 2011. Around the same time, when a lot of other groups, Thomas talked about his activity, there was a navigation guide group at UCSF also beginning to sort of really try to promote systematic review in environmental health. the NTP, where I was at this time, was very interested. So there was just really sort of a critical mass of interest here. And so just this past year, this IRIS handbook has been released for public comment. So you're talking about a document that took about a decade to produce. And a lot of that reflects the learning curve to sort of for this group to really understand what systematic review was, to begin to sort of look at the methods that have been developed in other arenas, in particular clinical medicine, and think about how do you extrapolate those to environmental health. And then just a lot of extensive engagement in terms of engagement with other parts of EPA. The IRIS program is not the only part of EPA that does systematic review. One of our panel members, Tala Henry, she works in the Office of Pesticide, Pollution Prevention and Toxics, I'm getting the acronym right, OPPT, and they implement the TSCA program, and that program has its own systematic review methods. So part of that engagement was working within EPA and talking to other programs that were implementing systematic review to find areas where we can harmonize. It was also talking to other federal programs, not just NTP, but a lot of state programs, a lot of academics who are interested in systematic review. There were a lot of workshops. So that decade of development reflects a lot of engagement. So this handbook is currently undergoing peer review by the National Academy of Science. It was released for public comment in November to March. So the public comment period has ended, and now the panel is actually doing the review. We expect a report in November, so anytime now. It's important to emphasize that the handbook will be evergreen. So this certainly reflects where we're stabilizing on our methods, but we envision that there are parts of the methodologies that will continue to be refined. For example, one of the challenges is thinking about, how do you deal with the mechanistic information, in particular when you're dealing with a topic that has a lot of evidence, a lot of human evidence, a lot of animal bioassay evidence, and then what do you do with what may be hundreds to thousands of in vitro studies? And so I think as a field, this remains one area that we think about in terms of keeping the transparency, keeping the credibility, but also being pragmatic in terms of how much do we delve into areas which may be very impactful for some assessments and potentially not very impactful for others. Here's just a schematic showing some of that engagement. I won't read all of these, but you can see it starts in 2011 with the NAS formaldehyde report. And then the blue would be points where we had specific NAS engagement. So you can see the NAS, we had sort of check-in meetings, if you will, in terms of getting feedback on the progress to date. There was one in 2014, we had another one in 2018, and then of course now we have the handbook being undergoing peer review. Also on here, you'll see that there were, in green, you see a variety of other public meetings. They might be presentations to advisory boards. They might be getting feedback on specific chemicals like the formaldehyde workshop, but you're also getting feedback on systematic review approaches for study evaluation and weight of evidence. We've had through NAS, we've had a number of workshops. Here's another one in 2018. NAS Mechanistic Data Workshop, again, this is an area that as a community, the environmental health group is really sort of wrestling about how to keep that pragmatic, but yet sort of transparent. And then we've had a number in purple, external partner or SR expert meetings. So these might be meetings with other federal agencies. Our next speaker, Holger, has come to speak to our group. Again, I mentioned before that we've had meetings with state agencies. And one of the things that we look from here is, again, around during this past decade, I hear the dinging. Okay. I think I'll save this because I think it'll come up in the panel discussion. So just in terms of, I will go a little bit fast because I heard the dinging, which means I'm running out of time. Systematic review within the IRIS program basically encompasses everything from scoping and problem formulation all the way to selecting studies that drive the derivation of toxicity values and selecting models. We have a number of documents. So we have the IRIS handbook, which I've described. We also have assessment plans, which undergo public release and public comment. that describes what the assessment will cover. So this would be the scoping and problem formulation. And then we get feedback, we make some adjustments, and then we release protocols, which is how the assessment will be conducted. And that also is released for public comment. Here is the IRIS process, indicating sort of where we get that feedback on some of the assessment plans and the protocols. A lot of the systematic review happens in step one, and I'll kind of breeze through these, but I mentioned that IRIS programs undergo a great deal of review. There's review across the EPA, agency review. There's review by other federal agencies, goes out for public comment, an external peer review, it gets revised. And then again, there's sort of additional circling back to the agency and to interagency reviewers, and then posting. And here's just an example of PFBA of a very recent assessment that we've released that is the most mature in terms of reflecting the handbook methodologies. And then just a plug for a couple of upcoming NAS workshops in 22. These have not been scheduled yet in terms of the date, but they will be happening in 2022. One will be advances made during application of artificial intelligence and open data practices, and the other will be triangulation of evidence in environmental epidemiology. And then lastly, I just want to acknowledge the many, many people who have really helped to bring systematic review to the IRIS program. That's my last slide.
Thank you, Kris.
Thanks, Kris. This Sebastian. We have time for one or two quick questions. There was one from Marcelo in the Q&A, and he asked if there's a training program from US EPA or others for systematic review in regulatory processes that scientists and academics from the developing countries may attend.
Yes, we do provide training, and we have a variety of mechanisms. It can be, we have staff in our group who provide training on some of these specialized software applications. So it's a pretty informal process in terms of somebody reaching out, and we think about what the need is. So we have that. We have a variety of MOUs with different academic institutions where we can sort of help with training of students. We can sort of work outside the MOU project, but it's pretty informal in the sense that somebody reaches out to us and we try to understand what specifically is needed in terms of the training, and then devise an approach to help address that.
Thanks, Kris. I have another quick one. Can you already give an estimate when you expect the handbook to come out to be released?
Well, so the draft handbook has been released for public comment. Yeah. We will get the NAS report anytime now. So I would say in 2023, we'd like to finalize it. I mentioned that the TSCA program at EPA has also had their own systematic group review methods, and they've also had input from the National Academy of Science. So we'll also be sort of looking for ways that we can begin to sort of harmonize across the two programs. There's different uses of the different assessments, so they're not going to be exactly the same. The TSCA has sort of a broader remit in terms of not just focusing on the human evidence. But I would say that because we want to really kind of work hand in hand, I would say 2023.
Thanks, Kris. I think we're good in time. Katja, do you take over again?
Yes, yes. I just wanted to chime in here on the EBTC YouTube channel and other activities that we put together. It was also we do a lot of training in our working groups and actual real projects. So we work with many volunteers who participate and get training. So please reach out either through the subscribing to the newsletter or directly through EBTC website or directly to me. So with that, thank you, Kris, again. This is wonderful to have that collaboration with EPA that started many years ago, and great to have you on the board. With that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Holger Schunemann. Holger is a professor of clinical epidemiology and of medicine at McMaster University. He also is a director of Cochrane Canada, the co-chair of the GRADE Working Group, and a board member of EBTC. Holger, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me, Katja. I'm just going to do a quick sound check with you or anybody else. You can hear me okay? You can see my screen?
All good.
Yeah, super. Okay. Yeah, Katja, thanks so much for having me. And the title of my presentation is Certainty and Evidence for Environmental Health Claims. Katja asked us to talk a little bit about ourselves. I'm working at McMaster University, which is located in beautiful Hamilton, close to Toronto. Thomas referred to evidence-based medicine, which is what McMaster is really known for. And just to circle back also, William Osler was from somewhere there. We have a beautiful Osler house in Hamilton, where we like to host our university guests. He spent some time in Hamilton as well. Disclosures that relate to also speaking about myself. I don't have any direct financial conflicts here for today. I'm co-chair of the GRADE Working Group, as Katja mentioned. I'll be mentioning the GRADE Pro app, which is GRADE's official application to use GRADE. I'm director of Cochrane Canada. That speaks a lot about my career. I'm interested in systematic reviews, and in particular in how systematic reviews make it into healthcare recommendations. I'm on the board of the Guidelines International Network in this context. What I will say today is really all my own views, so what I will express. There are some colleagues who I've worked with closely on some of the work that I will be presenting here. And to also speak about myself a little bit more, I'm the past chair of the Department of Health Evidence and Impact, which was formerly the Department of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics at McMaster. I did my 2 terms and finished that about 2 years ago, and now primarily focus on these activities. I'm a practicing internist, which is quite relevant. We like to make sure that our work is people-oriented, sometimes patient-oriented, and have a PhD in epidemiology. So the objectives for today are to provide an overview of elements of the GRADE approach to communicate certainty in a body of evidence. And if I had prepared polling questions, I would ask you now who of you had heard about GRADE. But I don't have those prepared. I imagine imaginary hands going up in the room, and that being about 50%, and that is kind of the approach that I will be taking about in terms of talking about GRADE. The GRADE Working Group was created or got together to develop a unifying, transparent, and sensible system for grading the certainty of evidence and making decisions. We started this work in 2000, so 21 years ago, with collaboration from major organizations, including the WHO, NICE in the UK, many other organizations and professional societies that are not necessarily listed here. There's over 100 of them that help develop and use GRADE. We are a community of over 1,000 people now. GRADE is for systematic reviews, following up on Kris Thayer's talk, for health technology assessment, and then making decisions, in particular in the context of health guidelines. It's been used in thousands, literally, of recommendations. Our work has been cited very widely. This is probably going to be updated now to over 100,000 citations of our publications. We publish guidance articles, that is how to apply the approach that I will be talking about, concept articles, that is new things that we think should be tackled. We are not exactly sure yet whether that makes it into guidance articles, and then publications that others put forward about either how GRADE is working or not working, that then helps us to develop research agendas, or a research agenda in general. There is a handbook of GRADE, and there is an application that helps with dissemination and adaptation of recommendations. One of the fundamental underlying principles for GRADE is a clear definition of what we mean by certainty of evidence. It has to do with the certainty that an estimate of association or effect is correct, or better, that a true effect lies on one side of a specified threshold or within a chosen range. I'll get back to that. GRADE starts with and has made contributions to asking the right question. There is some, in our view, when there is an assessment of an exposure and an effect, that we can assign a certainty to, a certainty in causality, for instance, in this particular instance. When we do that, we typically have further downstream consequences in mind, and that has to do with, for instance, interventions. I'll make that a little bit clearer here. So, for instance, take that example, what the effects of bisphenol BPA exposure in just people, the general population, compared to no exposure or different levels of exposure might be on weight. This is a typical formulation of an exposure-related question. We call it the Peco question or PECO question. And that is quite relevant for then determining whether or not one would want to implement regulation or policies or other acts that would regulate the use of BPA. And in those instances, we are dealing with interventions that typically lead to decisions where the modification of, for instance, BPA exposure would be the intervention, and it would lead to the Peco question. We've developed a framework to make that clearer that I think is relatively helpful or will be quite helpful. It's called the Population Exposure Comparison Outcomes and Questions Peco framework. This was published by a former grad student of mine, Rebecca Morgan, where we laid out 5 paradigmatic scenarios for asking the right questions about exposures that can then lead to interventions. And that is that there was no guiding framework for operationalizing these type of questions before. And in environmental, public, and occupational health research, there were real challenges with formulating these type of questions that I just described. So these 5 paradigmatic approaches are actually quite helpful in then moving to an evidence assessment, and as well as making decisions. So I give you one quick example. The first of these 5 paradigmatic questions or approaches is, for instance, about exploring the shape and distribution of a relationship between the exposure and the outcome in a systematic review that can then lead to calculating the health effect from an exposure on an outcome and will serve with risk characterization. I will spare you the other 4 approaches in the interest of time. I want to talk about the factors that determine the certainty in grade. And one disclosure is very important, and that is that grade is a further development, I would say, of underlying principles about assessing causality and how certain we can be in an association. And that obviously starts with Bradford Hill. The work of Bradford Hill, only about 15 years later, was used by a group of very smart individuals who transferred that type of assessment to the clinical world. This was led by Dave Sackett and Walter Spitzer in Canada, and dealt with the periodic health examination under the auspices of the Canadian Task Force on the Periodic Health Examination. And that was actually quite relevant work because it was the foundation for probably evidence-based medicine. They developed levels of evidence based on study designs. The better the study, the less risk of bias there was, the higher was the level of evidence. And you will have all heard about these level 1, 2, 3 evidence systems. However, that was, in our view, not enough when we created GRADE about then 20 years later. So we went from these Bradford Hill criteria to Dave Sackett and his colleagues in the levels of evidence to the GRADE approach. And GRADE is actually quite simple when it comes to assessing the certainty of evidence. It's simple in that it asks some very classic signaling questions, but the big contribution of GRADE has been to operationalize the answers to these questions that are relevant for assessing the certainty. So the first question is, are the research studies actually well done? And in a more formal way, this has to do with limitations in study design and execution or risk of bias. The second question we ask is, are the results consistent across studies? That is called inconsistency. Third question is, how directly do the results relate to our questions? And that has to do with the Peco, the population exposure comparison and outcome element of the question. So we assess indirectness of the research evidence in comparison to our question of interest. Is the effect size precise, or is it due to random error? That has to do with imprecision, the fourth domain. And the fifth domain has to do with whether or not we are really aware of all the research that has been done and all the studies that have been conducted. It falls into the domain of publication bias. And then very relevant in the context of environmental health claims is there anything else that makes us particularly certain? That has to do with large effects, a more complicated domain of worst case. The worst case scenario is still allowing for strong conclusions, has to do with residual plausible confounding, and then the exposure effect relations. The interesting thing is that all of these type of questions, these signaling questions, are applicable not only to exposures, but they are also applicable to treatment, tests, prognosis, values, utilities, and prediction models, and so on. And the further development from Bradford Hill has been laid out in this particular paper, where we described how the great domains that I just described or mentioned relate to the actual Bradford Hill criteria. And so what has happened is that not everything in the Bradford Hill criteria or aspects really made sense. 50 years had passed. Bradford Hill was one person. The Sackett and Spitzer group, where a few people, has become a community of more than 1,000 people. And I will give one very quick example of recent work that we've done that actually Paul Wally has led. And that has to do with how we think biological plausibility in the Bradford Hill aspects or criteria is actually covered by considerations around indirectness. And that indirectness may relate to surrogates, and it may relate to information from mechanistic studies that help us make judgments about primarily around indirectness. This is a paper that hopefully will come out very soon, so that our assessment of the certainty, considering all of these questions that I mentioned, and in particular questions in the environmental health context around indirectness, lead to saying we're either very confident in this association, very confident, or we are not confident at all, and GRADE categorizes that into 4 different levels. This is from a paper by Rebecca Morgan, again, that highlights this process from going from a systematic review to a risk of bias assessment in individual studies and across studies, to integrate a risk of bias assessment, which was the primary, which is one of the primary tasks of a systematic review, into a more comprehensive assessment using these domains that I described to come up with a final certainty of evidence assessment. We display this information in what we call evidence profiles, where the individual domains that I described are mentioned and assessed based on a detailed operationalization of these domains, where each outcome is described with regards to what evidence is underlying and how certain we can be, for instance, in an odds ratio or an absolute effect that results from that systematic review. And what GRADE emphasizes is transparency. It's transparency around explaining why certain judgments have been made. We do this in explanatory footnotes. All of that to mention the last piece that we contributed relatively recently, all of that to say that for any type of assessment, whether it's an urgent assessment, an emergency assessment, or a routine assessment of the certainty of evidence, these domains, these signaling questions can be utilized to be transparent and to express the certainty. And we do this, this is our seminal slide, I would say. We do this in a very structured process that goes from the formulation of the question, either Peco or Peco question, to these evidence profiles based on systematic reviews, to decision criteria, to then formulate either a recommendation or inform an assessment about a threshold. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be with you virtually. Back to you, Katja.
Thank you so much, Holger. I think we'll hold the questions to the end because we are running a little bit behind, but it was great to hear this perspective and the connection and the progress that has been made in applying these methods developed in clinical medicine really back to epidemiology, right? I just learned that it was actually the Cochrane method was developed using epidemiological evidence. So with that, I'd like to ask Didier Verloo from European Food Safety Authority to present the EFSA perspective on using the evidence and systematic approaches. So Didier is a board member of Ebtc as well as Holger and Kris, and he's a head of assessment and methodological support unit at European Food Safety Authority. Welcome, Didier.
Thank you very much, Katja. I'm still in the process of sharing my screen.
You're sharing, Didier. Just need to go into presentation mode.
Exactly.
You can show your video too if you want.
Yeah, oh, but I opened it. No, yes. React. Allez. Here we go. This should be better.
Perfect, yes.
Okay. So hi, everybody. So my name is Didier Verloo, and greetings from Italy from my side here. Good evening from Italy, in fact. So a bit about myself. So I'm heading the Assessment and Methodological Support Unit here in EFSA. And this is a unit dealing with methodological aspects, methodological support, providing methodological support to all the different areas in EFSA. So I speak here in the name of this big group of people, of course, in EFSA that are working on this, on the application of systematic review over all those years, and even a bigger group on the people who are really implementing it in EFSA. So to continue with just some words on EFSA's role. So EFSA is the risk assessment body of the European Commission regarding food safety, feed safety, animal health, animal welfare, plant health, and nutrition. And risk assessment for EFSA is typically triggered by a mandate, a question, coming from the risk manager, giving the risk assessment specific terms of reference and a delivery date. And the owner of the questions are typically the European Commission, the EU Parliament, or the member states. Also, EFSA, of course, can also mandate itself in case it's deemed necessary. So let's dig a bit further now into the risk assessment process and the role that systematic review has in it and how it contributed also into shaping the risk assessment process over the years. So, and for this, we're going to talk about the evolution of systematic review, and we're going to map it on this beautiful picture. And for the ease of reference, I have subdivided it in different phases with some kind of a time indication. So the guidance phase, which was initiated around 2008 and finalized around 2010. The implementation framework, which was initiated a bit later. The process integration, so how we really put it into the EFSA process. And I'm going to give an example on how it relates with specific process, such as our quality process or quality certification, and then into our end-to-end science processes. Then what we are doing now, the process digitalization, and then the future. So the future is already now, of course, but how we are moving further and how we are building further on these different aspects that we, that are depicted here. So let's start with the guidance, the systematic review guidance. So now back in 2008, so triggered by the use of systematic review in public health and medicine and the advantages it brings related to the methodological rigor, the transparency and reproducibility, we mandated ourselves to get at work on producing a guidance on the application of systematic review methodology for food and feed safety risk assessment. So for this, we gathered experts to work together with from different institutions across the world, such as the Cochrane collaboration to name one. And the guidance, which was published in 2010, provides them guidance on how to assess the question's suitability for systematic review in order to be able to determine what can be addressed and what cannot be addressed by systematic review, including also guidance on how to determine the need for systematic review when dealing with broad food and feed safety problems. And once we started to use the guidance, it became very clear we needed a more applied and fit for purpose approach to implement it really into the EFSA framework of our risk assessment. So which brings us to the second phase, the implementation framework. And during this period, we really worked on how the principles brought forward in the guidance and the lessons we learned during the early use of the guidance can be translated into a framework which fits into the risk assessment process, taking into account also the wide remit of this framework in EFSA, like I named before, animal health, welfare, nutrition, plant health, and so on. So during the project, we basically redesigned the risk assessment framework and restructured it by bringing in aspects related to systematic review, which means we brought in the different phases noted in the slide in the risk assessment and clearly introduced a planning phase where the protocol documents the data needs and the whole methodological approach of the risk assessment before the actual initialization of the risk assessment, which would be then the do phase. We did not do this alone. We learned from others. We collaborated with different partners. And here mainly the work done with Ebtc also, and the network offered by Ebtc was and is still extremely valuable. We organized together events such as the Evidence Integration Colloquium and the workshop on evidence-based methods in AOPs, and we are continuously finding further topics that benefits to be looked at jointly from together with also Ebtc. In the meantime, also in-house, we proceeded with further officialization, let's say officialization of the implementation framework. And here I want to highlight two aspects really. So firstly, being the let's call it marriage between the implementation framework and the ISO 9001-2015 ISO certification that EFSA acquired in the meantime also. And secondly, the review of EFSA's founding regulation into what we call the transparency regulation, where the need for transparency and engagement in the risk assessment process has been put to even higher standards than it was the case before. And this transparency regulation kicked in this year in 2021. So first, quality. So the ISO certification on quality, in very simple terms, is all about customer satisfaction. How do you organize your processes and how can you show a plan, do, check, act cycle in everything you do in order to continuously optimize the customer satisfaction? That's in very simple words, the ISO 9001-2015. So now in risk assessment, the customer is the owner of the question, the risk manager, call it, like shown in the first slide. So the mandate or question that comes into EFSA, where the societal needs have been incorporated by the risk manager and takes into and taking into account during the conceptualization of this mandate represents the needs of the risk manager for the risk assessment. And during this phase, we as risk assessor in EFSA interact with the risk manager to guarantee that we will do what we will do results in a fit for purpose risk assessment that is valuable for the risk manager decision-making process, that it's extremely fit for purpose. So this all results in a distinct planning phase, like I said before, where the whole blueprint of the risk assessment is documented in the protocol, followed by a do phase where the execution of the risk assessment is done according to and checked against the protocol, where possible revisions can be done if deemed necessary. So hereby, clear alignment of the core risk assessment work to the quality certification. Secondly, comes the transparency and engagement, as I underlined before. So, and as also underlined in our recently revised founding regulation, which kicked into force in 2021. So here for the core process, we have several windows of engagement with society that are or mandatory in our regulation, or can be added in case there is a need identified during the mandate agreement phase with the risk manager. And there can be consultations, public consultations, or for example, stakeholder workshops. Could be on the level of the protocol before the initiation of the risk assessment, or there can be calls for additional data before or during the risk assessment process. There can be consultations on the draft risk assessment, or there can be citizen science activities to cover data gaps, and so on and so on. But really, this is all about transparency and engagement of this process. Bringing us to the next step, then the process digitalization, which somehow we kicked off a bit before that we really were engaging in this new founding regulation. So to manage, of course, this complicated and high throughput risk assessment process, EFSA adopted the use of business process and customer relation management cloud solutions. So the BPM, the business process management solution, clearly keep track of where we are in the process and makes this also visible to the citizens. While the customer relationship management solutions provide a way to automate as much as possible the phases where interactions with the customer and society is needed. So now I would like to stress it. So the fact that we were able to design the system based on experience gathered by using systematic review methodologies makes that this platform over time can be extended and further developed, rooting completely on this evidence-based backbone built into the system. So opportunities enough here to extend on what is already there, to mine the processes and to learn from it, to further optimize transparency, accessibility, accessibility of our work, and to further automate. Which brings us to the future, because here is the future, and the future starts now. So a few words on robotic process automation. And for this, I'd like to introduce you to my dear friend, Robbie. Here he is, Robbie. Now, while Robbie has an impressive business card underlining his today availability and direct implementation, it should be understood that by us all that Robbie is not, in fact, not that intelligent, but let's keep it silent. So nevertheless, Robbie likes to do tasks such as classifying documents, pictures, data sets, following what it learned from a set of examples delivered in general by its human colleagues, by our experts. This without the need to explain to Robbie exactly what he should look at in order to make a decision. Robbie learns by itself. So once learned, Robbie does this at speeds that are only limited by the computational capacity where he's surrounded by. And we apply Robbie according to the following principle. Think big, but start small. So what are the little parts of the processes where the learning examples, where the data, the learning data is available, also thanks, of course, to the process digitalization, or are easy to be collected, hence are candidates for automation. So let's start for the risk assessment process then with the planning phase. So the planning phase where the terms of references are translated into the assessment question and the conceptual model is described. So followed by laying down the methods and the methods and evidence needs for addressing the problem in the protocol. So while there are roles for Robbie in scoping literature here or mining knowledge acquired in the past or similar problems, this is typically still a human expert-driven process. And it should be, as it is the backbone, of course, of the risk assessment and the only guarantee for a fit-for-purpose answer. So problem formulation stays a human-centered business. So the do phase, however, so where the data is collected, appraised, and integrated according to the predefined methodological approaches, is a phase where there are plenty of tasks for Robbie. So, and as this is about systematic review here, let's dive a bit deeper into an example of applying AI in a systematic review process, which, as we know, is a methodological, because this is all about systematic review, is a funnel-like approach to select, appraise, and synthesize evidence coming from literature. So in systematic review for the screening of abstracts, we currently use AI in more and more of the ongoing risk assessments. The screening starts with 2 persons, and at a certain point, the AI learned enough, and following our working guidelines, then takes over from one of the experts. This is something that we say from ourselves, there should still be a human in the loop, keeping a human in that way in the loop during the whole process. So for the data extraction phase, for example, we have also activities ongoing with US EPA to develop named entity recognition approaches based on an ontology that we are building from historical EFSA systematic reviews. Now, as a final thought, what have we learned during this 10 years, more than 10 years of the use of systematic review? So first of all, work with the best, so like we developed our guidance, but be applied. So minimize this gap between the implementation framework and the guidance development. So between the application, the theory and the application. So collaborate also, steal ideas, learn, and well, don't stop there. So when you are further incorporated into, into the business DNA, this is really about evolution after all. So work at all levels. Work with the people in administration and business planning. Make sure that you have sponsorship and support in the highest level of the organization. Be flexible, revise, reiterate, and change. And once you start dealing with process digitalization, then make sure that you have your business case ready in a language that is understood by the audience that you are addressing. So learn the IT language, have your story ready, jump on every opportunity that there is to make progress, though be patient. We had to learn this, to be patient, and we are still learning better to be patient. And as for the further automation, also think big, but start small. So explore what is existing and what can be used with minor adjustments. Build up your little success base. It's like I tried to show where on how we for systematic review, then automate the abstract screening process. And as a general note, so the future of evidence-based risk assessment is of course, in multi-stakeholder engagement and collaboration throughout the process. So work together. So in this context, thanks a lot for the opportunity to talk here and for the intense collaboration of the last bit less than 10 years also between EFSA and Ebtc. And with this, I run to the presentation, I realize, but I'm here then for questions and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Didier. So Sebastian, do we have questions? We have time probably for one question because Didier ran so quickly through his presentation that we have caught up on time.
Yeah, Katja, there's one in the Q&A from Catherine. How do you avoid introducing bias in interpreting the results and drawing conclusions? For example, coming to a conclusion that the data do not support. This is happening in systematic reviews, and I'm concerned that we are missing a step to exclude bias at this important last step.
I'm not sure the question was addressed to me. Was it not to the previous presentation? No?
It came up.
Yeah, Holger could take it also if you would like to.
Absolutely, I can try to take that. So it's actually a great question. Our approach to that is don't rely too much on the interpretation of the systematic review. Focus on the actual facts. This is the same as for individual studies, right? People like to interpret data in the way that they do. So focus on the certainty assessment and focus on the certainty around the effect estimates. I think there's a huge, you're absolutely right. There's a huge issue with interpretation bias based both in systematic reviews as well as in single studies. So avoid the discussion except for the strengths and limitations possibly.
Thanks, Holger. I think we're running out of time. We try to answer other questions in the Q&A. Katja, I suggest we move on.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. And thank you for your questions. So we are moving to the last speaker in our impressive lineup. So Michelle is going to take us straight into that AI thing. So the last question may be answered here. So Michelle is working with Kris at the US EPA, and she's the one deploying a lot of these tools that were mentioned in previous presentation by Didier. Thank you, Michelle, and Kris, please, floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Does everything look good?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. This is actually great to come after Didier, because the talk that I'll be giving today is about harnessing AI to bridge the systematic method and environmental health data divide. And so just a little bit about me. I'm a toxicologist with PhDs in genetics and toxicology. I am at the Environmental Protection Agency Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment. I'm in Kris's division, and my primary role is developing chemical assessments, but I also work in the Office of Research and Development and get to do a whole lot of fun R&D stuff that you're going to hear about today. Okay, so what are we talking about in terms of harnessing AI, incorporating systematic review methods? We're really talking about how we can reduce the cognitive burden. It's just systematic review takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. But what we realized in trying to automate systematic methods is that there's a huge need for data harmonization. So I'll be talking a bit about that. There's also huge issues with data interoperability. We use various systematic review tools, and it's often difficult to get data to flow from one to the other. Also needing kind of like a roadmap. And so I'll introduce adverse outcome pathways as an integrative construct for organizing the evidence. There's a huge need and value in community and in collaboration and in sustainable communities. And I'll give a plug for some upcoming workshops. All right, so let's begin. The value of artificial intelligence. So AI has really, come to the forefront in environmental health sciences. In the past several years, we have diverse data streams that we're working with. We have a lot of data that we're trying to ingest, and honestly, we're just trying to keep up with the times and ensure that folks have the information available at their fingertips. Not so many folks are, going to libraries and articles as much as they're using web apps and walking around with their noses in their phones all the time. So why not put that information in front of them immediately? But it's really, really hard. So this is an example of environmental health publications pulled from PubMed from 1984 until just recently. And as you can see, there's, 40,000 new pubs coming in. And this is just for term searching environmental health. And so humans just do not have the cognitive bandwidth to keep up with the pace of this information. And what we'd really like to do is automatically update the information as it comes in. So here's an example from a project that we had at the EPA search that returned 42,000 records, so 42,000 individual studies that all need to be screened by people. And so, you multiply 42,000 abstracts by our average rate of screening, which is 110 seconds per abstract. That's 1,283 hours. It's a really resource intensive job, but really important that we rapidly compile this information, especially in the regulatory context where it's important to update the information as it comes in. So how do we run this race a lot smarter? Well, we run this race smarter by leveraging existing AI. There's some tools out there that are really useful for doing things such as topic clustering, and Didier mentioned a few of these. And so what we've done is incorporated some of these tools into the process, and these tools use natural language processing, machine learning to really reduce the cognitive burden on people. They also mentioned human in the loop. That's critical. We need a human in the loop to kind of monitor the process. And so here's an example, the same example where, 42,000 search results, take those results, topic cluster them, having a human interacting with the tool, take those results and then do active learning to screen. And we were able to reduce this time from 1,283 hours to only 93 hours, which is quite amazing. So there's still additional challenges, though. This is only looking at, screening and looking through information as it comes in at the title and abstract level. Keep in mind that computers, they need to be taught. They're babies in this world of AI and environmental health sciences. So what we need to do is to teach them how to read an entire document, not just the titles and abstracts. I'm sure many of you are aware that a great deal of information is embedded in the methods and in the results, and it's not always apparent in the titles and abstracts of studies. So what we need to do is take our computer students, our computational students, and give them input so that they can create and further refine the models. Specifically, we need to teach them how to find the data that is useful to us. We need to teach them how to build connections between the data. We need to specify relationships between the data, such as, an animal group belongs to a specific dose regime and a specific endpoint is a result of that treatment. We have to teach the computer, we have to teach the machines how to do all of this. And also semantics is really, it's really key here. Language can be interpreted in so many ways. And so training data are really critical. The collaborations are really critical in creating training data. It's needed, and it's not always the fun part. Building models is fun, but we need the data so that we can build the models. There's also a lot of opportunity that comes along with this challenge, but we're not driving ourselves yet, because if you kind of think about it, this is the way I like to think about it. We have to, so we're teaching, we're working with modelers to develop models so that the computer can do some of the things to assist humans, but we have to teach them the rules of the road. So what does a stop sign mean? which side of the road do you drive on? I mean, all of these things are really important when you think about migrating data between different tools, mapping schemas between different tools. So, you know, and just how do we kind of wrangle the data to organize it and harmonize it? These are all different pathways that I like to think about on a roadway to get from, you know, the initial problem formulation to the expected outcome or the envisioned end goal. And so, man, if only there were an integrative construct to help organize all this biological information. Well, guess what? There is. The adverse outcome pathway framework is available, and it's an integrative construct for organizing evidence that might be related to your particular environmental health problem. And so AOPs are, you know, they're essentially knowledge graphs where you can input all of the information related to your publications or the research that you're reviewing and screening and extracting data from. There are maps. They, you know, going back to my roadway map, we have to teach the computer how to navigate these different maps. And here we're trying to teach computers how to navigate not only reading the studies and the information that folks are publishing, but also navigate the complex biological pathways and the information that is informing, you know, progression along that pathway to a particular outcome. And so EBTC has been exceptionally wonderful in fostering the collaboration between systematic methodologists and AOP developers. And, you know, during the Hamilton and Parma workshops in Ontario and Italy, got me in touch with Betty Meek at the University of Ottawa. And so now we are leading a initiative within the handbook, AOP handbook, guidance and gardening group within OECD to incorporate systematic methods into the AOP development process. And so again, like challenge opportunities is such an exciting area, and there's so much growth occurring. It's very rapid. And so, you know, we really need researchers to get engaged in how they describe and compare their findings. There's a need for data managers and organizers to represent their data in a way, you know, that's human and machine readable. We need the folks who are actually managing and, you know, wrangling the data for finding the information and integrating the data for analysis. And it's really critical that folks who are grabbing this data work with the model developers so that we both understand each other and the needs that both require to advance the tools. So if you don't have a model developer talking to your user, you got to have that. And then we also need knowledge graphs. This isn't a one-to-one relationship. Often it's complex. It's biology. It's kind of a graphical space. So we need to develop, you know, graph databases and have developers that are capable of assisting folks like me who are more of a user in linking the data together. And so, you know, true developers are very useful in making the apps, but we want to make sure that the apps are interoperable so that we can put them all together and get the information at your fingertips in a meaningful way. And so we're really seeking out, you know, additional community engagement and collaboration. And this is a big goal within the evidence-based toxicology collaboration. And here, there are a couple links that I have up here for doing such that. And another one that's new is the Environmental Health Language Collaborative. And so this is being led by Stephanie Holmgren at NIEHS. And it's about harmonizing data, connecting knowledge, and improving health. And there's a big pitch here on ontologies and vocabularies and just language and general language for describing your information and how are you documenting. And I'd like to give a plug for an upcoming, the first Adverse Outcome Pathway Community of Practice Symposium that's going to take place in February. There will be 3 different days that it occurs in 2022. And the goal is for folks to register by December 3rd. And I have to just give another plug again to thank the Evidence-based Toxicology Collaboration for all the opportunity that they have provided me as well as other folks, and really connecting and engaging folks from diverse backgrounds into a platform into situations such as Hamilton, Ontario, and Parma, Italy, where we got together and worked on some of these problems and really discussed. And I believe the workshop reports for both from Hamilton is out, it's available for reading, and the one from Parma is going to be available shortly. And so with that, I am done and would like to thank various folks, and in particular, the folks at EBTC, EPA, and Betty.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. This is great to have you on our Scientific Advisory Council and having all these projects and collaboration started together. We will cut straight to the panel at this point again, because we're running a little bit tight on time, and we'll address some of the questions that have come up. Please put more questions, put more of your thoughts on in the chat or the Q&A. We have one technical problem with one of the panelists. Unfortunately, we hope
Tal is here.
Tal is here. Okay, great, wonderful. Let me just quickly introduce to you our panelists and the moderator. So the panel is going to be moderated by Jack. Just one sec. Okay, hopefully you'll see the right slide now. So the panel is going to be moderated by Jack Fowle, who is I have a pleasure of working with in his capacity of president of EBTC Board of Trustees. He actually was originally at the inauguration of EBTC in 2011 at SOT. So he's been with the organization from the very beginning and helped form and shape it. So Dr. Fowle has spent over 30 years at the EPA with various positions, and also holds positions at, helped started actually American Society of Computational Toxicology, where he currently is the president. He also serves on the board of directors for the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing and the Institute for In Vitro Sciences in Gatesburg, Maryland. He is the president of the American Society of Cellular Computational Toxicology and the past president of the Society of Toxicology's In Vitro and Alternative Method Specialty Section. And he is a board certified toxicologist. So I'd like to introduce our panel, which is wonderful to have a very diverse group of individuals working on very different projects, but united by the passion for the evidence, transparency, and getting to the right answer. So we have Kris Thayer, who you already heard from. She's at the EPA. She's joined by Richard Brown, who works at the WHO, World Health Organization. He's a technical officer in Chemical Safety and Health Unit. Tala Henry, who is a deputy director of Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxic, and has a lot of experience over the last few years in applying the systematic methods and systematic reviews to the new Lichtenberg Act, new TASCA program at EPA. Betty Meek, she is at the University of Ottawa and also previously was working at Health Canada. She's one of the pioneers of applying adverse outcome pathways to toxicology. And she's working a lot with Michelle now at the OECD group, applying systematic literature approaches to AOP adverse outcome pathway programs. And last but not least, we have Bernard von Rosenwey. He is a senior vice president of experimental toxicology and ecology department at BASF. So with that, I'll give the floor to Jack. So we are mainly addressing 3 questions. And of course, the audience can also pose theirs after we go through the first round. What are the opportunities that evidence-based methods hold for decision-making in toxicology and environmental health, then what are the main challenges that you see in adopting the evidence-based toxicology methods? And the third question is, what should be EBTC's focus after those 10 years to help with adoption and address these challenges? So these are the three questions. I guess we are going in order of the first and second are really sort of together. So I'll give Jack the floor and take it away.
Thank you so much, Katja. And I want to thank the panel. We're very fortunate to have such a distinguished panel to join us here for the 10th year celebration of the formation of the EPTC, as well as having our previous speakers and the participants as well. Unfortunately, we have that's a great side. The sad side is because it's a virtual conference, we have very limited time for our discussion. So we're going to have to keep our points very focused and sort of keep the time to minimal. So I'm going to be keeping time at the risk of sounding rude. I may, as gently as I possibly can, suggest maybe we engage some of the other speakers. As Katja said, we're going to start with the first two questions put to our panel, and that is, what opportunities do the evidence-based methods hold for help inform decision-making, and what challenges have they seen? And I'd like first to call on Kris Thayer, who we've heard from already, who's one of the pioneers in systematic review and toxicology, and she's been instrumental in developing and adopting these methods. So Kris, why don't you take maybe no more than 2 to 3 minutes, please, and address those first two questions.
Sure. I mean, I guess sort of at a big level, in terms of the opportunity, is that you have an assessment that's more transparent, based on methods designed to minimize bias, make more transparent expert judgments. And that ultimately leads to a better foundation for making what can be very visible decision-making. So that's sort of at a big level. I would say some of the other opportunities are, a lot of this sort of really goes to some of the points that Didier raised in his lessons learned, where he talked about sort of the importance of really connecting, building off of what already exists. Don't be afraid to borrow or steal, and communicating. And so I think what's happening, and this really is probably easiest to see in terms of some of the workflows, especially those that are facilitated by specialized software applications, is that we're able to sort of really harmonize across different assessment groups. Even if the product is used for decision-making, different decisions, those front-end steps of identifying the information, organizing it, there's a lot of similarities there. So what that can do is sort of not just sort of harmonize the methodologies, but it makes it easier to repurpose. If one group has done something, it makes it easier for another group to do it, even if their decision-making context is different. So I would say those are opportunities. I really, really like Didier's slide in terms of the lessons learned. In terms of some of the challenges, I think a lot of people who haven't done it are sort of put off by the level of effort to learn. And that's true. There is a learning curve. But once you've kind of got past that, I, compared to doing sort of more narrative reviews, I like the clarity of the systematic review, not just sort of the ability to implement methods consistently across a large group of people. And in my team, there might be 50 people working on multiple assessments. So having consistency of the methods is a big one. Again, there's a learning curve, but once you get past that, there's a lot of appeal to having sort of the consistency. Let's see, other challenges, I think certainly thinking about what do you do with sort of very large evidence bases. We mentioned before some of the interest in mechanistic information and finding out, when you have to go in a little bit, when you have to go in a lot, which may be very specific to the kind of information that you have at hand for a chemical. I think that remains to be a challenge, but I feel like we're making real inroads over the past several years through our community-based conversations, many of which have been facilitated by EBTC. I think I'll stop there.
That sounds great. Kris, Betty, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, when I was asked to think about it, okay, how can we make this tangible in my field, which is really all about, in the end, regulatory decisions. And when you think about the transition from currently, or in the past at least, a complete in vivo database to an in vitro database, what we do see is that by now there are multiple ways to address or to predict adverse outcome. And this will increase further. So, it may be related to the identification of a molecular initiating event or key parameters along the adverse outcome pathway. We've had that in the presentations a couple of times. But what I also see coming is the combination of in vitro, be it molecular biology information, and in vivo data to maybe to be able to predict the presence of absence of toxicity and adverse outcome following exposure of a longer duration based on shorter term studies. Now, all of these sources of information, they need to be weighed and combined in a standardized form, in a uniform way, if you wish, to ensure that conclusions that are drawn are first transparent, but that they are, I would say, at least similar, ideally identical in different regions. So this is where I see the big opportunity to turn EBT really into something that has a tangible outcome in terms of the assessment of the safety studies that are performed for chemicals, agrochemicals, and pharmaceuticals. Now, that's the big opportunity. The challenge, or I would rather say the need, from my point of view, is a meticulous recording of all the data that underlie, in the end, the conclusions in an accessible way. And we're really talking about digitalization of toxicology here. And that might introduce like GLP or GMVP like standards, but in particular, I would say the availability of data. And I would say that would also extend more to scientific journals who I believe need to ask to have at least access to those data to be stored for inspection. And if we do that, I think that regulatory authorities, should be able to follow a EBT-based process better if they have full access to those data. And I guess that's to me it's a need, and it might be a challenge, but I think all the elements to do that are available.
Thank you, Bernard. And I think now maybe we will maybe, if you don't mind, we'll turn to Betty for input. But I would like to ask you this: we think to like opportunities for future. Maybe you could be thinking about whether you might share with us some of your experiences via SF, to the extent you might have applied some of these evidence-based approaches. Betty, would you mind giving us your views, please?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jack. So I think that the opportunities are considerable from the perspective of increasing consistency, reproducibility of our assessments. I think there are a number of challenges, though, in particular in application for fit-for-purpose assessment. So it's really important to understand the context and objectives of any assessment to tailor the tools to need. That actually is quite time-consuming. So, and I think actually, Chris, you made reference to that once you get people over the hurdle of actually using the tools, then you really need to work with them to kind of tailor what we have to their needs, what works, what doesn't work. So, and this context for assessment increasingly relates to greater efficiency in assessment. So this relates to the worldwide mandates pushing us to do a lot more with a lot less information. So it's really a delicate balance between how many resources we're investing and what we're getting out at the other end. So there's a need for flexibility in application of the tools. And the context is really important. This looking at the experience on the OECD AOP development program, we're looking at the data in a more integrating construct. So it's a more top-down kind of approach where we've actually, the weight of evidence that we're looking at there is really this kind of, integrating across different levels. So we need to determine how best to combine that, where to focus in terms of systematic methods. So I will leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Betty. Richard, perhaps you might share with us some of your international experiences with this.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to bring in the perspective of the lower middle income countries with fewer resources, who don't have the resources to do their own assessments and have to rely on assessments done by other organizations for making their decisions. And a real opportunity is to have a framework where it's clear that what data decisions have been made on and the basis for those decisions. So that transparency and the clear setting out of of how a decision was reached, I think is very important for countries who have to rely on those assessments and they're not able to do them themselves. And for those who can do some assessments, the resource savings which have been mentioned in terms of cutting down the total volume of data available in assessment down to the really important parts and strip out the unnecessary or superfluous evidence, simplifies the job. And so that resource saving could be really an advantage to internationalize the use of assessments. But the challenges are also the resources which are involved. Chemical risk assessment already requires a lot of resource. Doing everything in a very systematic way means you're going to need even more resource, and so it limits what you can work on. And I worry about a situation where you have a small number of assessments which are absolutely evidence-based, with really solid evidence behind them, but they only represent maybe 5% of the burden of health, and you've ignored 95% of the problem. And so there are challenges as well as opportunities there. But the advantages in bringing forward assessments which can be considered authoritative and people can understand where they've come from, I think is very important and very useful, like going forward in the future.
Thank you so much, Richard. Tala, maybe you could share with us, based on your experiences with implementing the Lautenberg amendments to TSCA and beyond, the opportunities that you've seen to date and the challenges faced as well, please.
Sure, Jack. And again, I'll focus just on our implementation to date, trying to incorporate systematic review into the TSCA enterprise. I can't even think of beyond yet because we're not completely there yet, Jack. But totally agree with what many of the other people, Kris and Betty in particular, said. The opportunities, of course, are the consistency, and especially if you're standing up a program that's meant to be forever more sort of a high throughput kind of enterprise, consistency can certainly help in the long run. And of course, the objectivity and transparency. Transparency, especially for government agencies, is highly, highly important. And I'll just build in one extra thing Bernard mentioned. TSCA also has some obligations for us regarding reduction of animal testing. So the fact that these systematic review methods are coming online and being applied directly into the whole NAMS arena and in vitro data streams is excellent, because we're trying to do all these things together. With regard to challenges, I think one of our biggest challenges is addressing criticisms about not just simply adopting or accepting or taking up what already exists. And I'm not quite 100% sure why we're not very effective in communicating why that is. But some of that is that we're doing risk assessments. So it's the full complement, all the different types and additional data streams, not just the toxicity. There's the human health tox, of course, which is the most advanced, but we have ecotox. But we also have many, we have to address exposure and all of that data. And there's many types of data just in the exposure realm, as well as fate. And we also do full, not just general population exposures, but occupational. So in a whole nother, it's an exposure data stream, but it's another kind of data. So we are trying to adapt. We need to adapt, and we're working very, very closely. And thank goodness Kris Thayer's at EPA now, because we are relying on her and Michelle and all those folks over there. They're teaching us a lot. But I think even just from working with them, I'm sure they would acknowledge that we have these challenges because we have all these other kinds of data as well. And some have encouraged us to still just adopt the tox part, but there's issues with that. We first of all, there's just sheer volume because of all the data just in the tox realm, not to mention all these other types of data. And because we're doing an integrated risk assessment, this gets at Betty's point about fit for purpose. We need to adopt these methods fit for a purpose. It's a fully integrated risk assessment. So there needs to be a certain kind of standard or consistency across our scientific disciplines, the people that do the work. The vernacular needs to be the same to some degree, harmonized as best as possible between the toxicologists, the exposure assessors, the data assessors, et cetera. So we do need to adapt the vernacular, the evaluation criteria. There has to be some amount of consistency for this to all come together in the end.
I don't want to cut you off, but maybe to help in keeping with the theme, let's move on. Maybe you could continue that thought just a little bit, maybe with the third question. Maybe you could with that in terms of how might EPT focus on with adopting it. I mean, I heard a couple challenges. One is not picking up what's already there. Also, how do you adapt and learn? And also you need standards, or maybe there's some other things. How might EBTC help address your needs there?
Well, I think the last point I was going to make was about these tools. As these tools come online in advance, we had a whole talk about the efficiencies and also the lessons learned. So all the things that the group do around that, the workshops and refining, making them able to be taken up, but also flexible enough to be adaptable, fit for purpose.
Okay, so I've kind of been focusing on the timing for the first two, but I've not been looking to overall timing. So Katya or Paul, I'll leave it up to you, but in terms of how much time we have to wrap this up, but I will open the floor now to the others in terms of how might EBTC best focus its resources as we look to the future.
We see so much interest in this panel that we've made a decision to skip the last presentation and just keep the conversation and discussion going. There's also a couple of interesting questions that popped up in the chat, so Sebastian can address them either now or maybe a little bit later.
Okay, so I don't know, Bernard, I'd asked you earlier, maybe have you in your company, or you're aware of others who've, done thinking about, obviously thought about how evidence is used to inform your decisions. What do you see maybe that EBTC might, could you share some of that with us for a second? And also how might EBTC help, if at all, with that?
Yes, we moved into EBTC because of our metabolome program. We're producing an incredible amount of data, and we're trying to make sort of sense out of data. And so you get individuals to go out and trying to connect modes of action of chemicals with specific metabolome patterns. And you got people back and, oh, I have an idea, And because this was pretty much, to be honest, chaos in the first year or 1.5 years. And it was really when we start to bring together peer review, best practices, and laying them down in, okay, this is how you could do it. And if you find other ways, come back to the panel, present it, we're going to learn from each other. But keep it systematic and keep it like, come back to the peer review panel and do it that way. And that turned out to be tremendously helpful, also an incentive, I guess, for everybody, because it was far more effective than just going around and trying to do this and that. There was still a little bit of, let's say, freedom available, but you always brought it back to the panel so that you could learn. And I think that I've heard too, it's the learning element. There is no one way of doing it perfect. There are several ways, but as long as you document it, you can do it consistently. And then it's actually not that difficult. It's just, it may be this threshold of going over it, but the fun actually is within a peer group. It became an incentive in a group to come up with, I've got this, I've got that. And so this is how we moved into it. And it just simply worked. And so then I said, okay, hey, this is what we can do for other exercises when it comes to judgment of multiple parameters or multiple information systems. So that's how we came into it. And yeah, I'm enthusiastic.
Very good, very good. So maybe helping bring the community together to help you and others out for that. That's very useful thing. So I don't know, Richard or Chris or Betty. Betty, yes, I see you raising your hand, please.
Just very quickly, Jack, because I know we don't have a lot of time, but it was, I wanted to kind of re-emphasize the point that I think, and EBTC has done some of this. I think it's really working with these user communities to help them along the way. And I think that's a two-way learning process. So bringing the technology, forward, bringing the methodology forward, but also it's tailoring those methods for application. So I think that's really important. So I think that there's been some communication issues in terms of systematic review methods, because it's very structured, it's very prescribed, and assessment doesn't really work that way. So the extent that we can increase the lines of communication, and Katja is participating in the AOP project, as is Michelle and others. So it's really bringing that to the fore for particular applications. And just one point I'd make is that, of course, we're challenged when we take it to these other communities and say, and that's a stepwise process. And the first is, let's just increase transparency. Then let's understand the tools and see how they can be used. We're challenged because they say, could we have some training? And, you really need, I don't know. It sounds like the training is being tailored, but if there was just even a basic consideration of where would you suggest that people start, and what are the first tools, and that we've really gone through that in the EOP program, but that's very time consuming, because you go, okay, so here's high level, here's more detail, but I think that's probably something to think about for future.
All right, thank you. That sounds very, very good. And I see some common themes here. And Richard, let's turn to you too. And part of what I just heard Betty say, one implication for that is, what kind of training needs and that sort of thing. I mean, you have the pulse on the world very much and so forth. So I don't know what your reaction to that is. I assume you agree with, but maybe we could have dialogue and communication with you too, in terms of thinking about how we might reach out to understand those needs and so on. But anyway, yes. Your thoughts, Richard, please.
Yeah, very much. I'd see an advantage of a collaboration like this in terms of developing tools and doing training as a kind of an independent group, which isn't any one particular country or isn't any one particular sector. And that's very useful. And somebody between the research and academic communities and the community of regulators, where communication has proven to be difficult, and these groups in between who bringing together these collaborations is very useful. So yes, I could very much see the advantage of training, but you've got to make it freely available, because people with no resources can't be spending a fortune on expensive ways of doing these things. So if people are willing to put these resources out for free, then that's going to be very much appreciated by those who have fewer resources to put to this.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And actually everything that EBTC does is free for everybody. So we have YouTube channel, and we are planning actually a variety of different training materials that will be available to everyone. If other groups that are working with us can help spread and disseminate that information, that would be really great. And we certainly are happy to work with other groups on some tailored tools as well.
So do we have Kris? We'll give you the last word here.
Yeah, I was wondering though, I saw some of the Q&A. Are we dealing with those, or should we focus on the panel charge questions?
I tell you what, I would tell you what, let's turn to our distinguished executive director for an answer to that question. What's the best use of time? The limited time we have.
Thank you, Jack. I think people should do what they want to do. It seems like we're having a robust discussion. So if Kris wants to jump on one of those questions, all power to you.
I think I will do the one. This is from, if Kris can provide a little bit more information about how EPA plans to formally harmonize across offices. I think you're going to see this reflected in the documentation of our methods. So you're going to see the TSCA program having protocols describing their methods. You're going to see the IRIS program having their protocols. You're going to see things from the Office of Water that are not in public domain. But when you look at the methods, what you're going to see is increasingly they look more and more alike. And especially on the front end, you're going to find that we're using the same specialized software applications for screening. In many cases, the form looks very similar. We're moving toward using the same structured approaches for data extraction, summarizing study methods and findings. And then, as I mentioned before, both the TSCA program and the IRIS program are going to be sort of discussing as we have our joint consideration of the separate feedbacks we've had from the NAS. But already, especially on the front end parts of those processes, there's a lot of similarity, and you're going to see that in the method descriptions that come, from the different programs. And I don't know if Tala wants to add anything, but that would be my answer.
I think I agree with that. And there's a kind of a related one for both of us, if you will. Someone asked if we were working on linking development of systematic review methods and tools to NAMs. And my answer there would be that to the extent that this isn't type of data that we're going to use in assessments, yes, certainly we see in vitro data in our data landscapes. And so we're figuring out what are the right kind of evaluation criteria and so forth for those. So it's underway. I don't know among the gurus of systematic review if we're all the way there. So Chris can probably say, but we're looking at those kind of data.
Thank you, Della. So one thing, I know we're kind of running out of time at the end. We've cut you so short, Katja, but I just want, I'm going to turn over now to you to proceed as you wish. But I just want to say it's absolutely my, yeah.
We're not running out of time. We ran out of time,
okay.
But that's fine. That's what we want to do, and that's what we always do in our workshops. Is really trying to get the conversation started and get people excited about the topic and joining together. So I'd like to just end with inviting everyone to contact us, to subscribe to the newsletter, LinkedIn group, follow our YouTube channel. We will post things in LinkedIn, and this webinar also will be on the YouTube channel. So we do have a lot of workshops. Hopefully they'll let us out of our cages at some point with this pandemic. Really looking forward to, again, meeting people face to face. I think just this discussion shows how much we have to say to each other, and it certainly is much more effective when we're face to face. So I'm just hoping that we'll meet again. We'll go to Parma, we'll go to Paris and Baltimore and Boston, and again meet. And we not only discuss the nerdy topics, we also have fun. So please join the collaboration, and hopefully we'll see you again and see you in person. We have a number of tools that are available from EBTC to members, such as special pricing on Distiller and others. So get in touch to learn more. And thank you again for all of your time. Really excited to have everybody participate so actively. Thank you.
And Katja, thank you for your time and all your diligence and hard work too. You're just truly exceptional. It's been my pleasure to work with you over these last 5 years, and I look forward to the future. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you.